Three Tales from Ancient My Enemy by Gordon R. Dickson, a collection of short stories originally published in 1974 and republished in 1976, 1980, and 1986. The first story, Tiger Green, was first published in the November 1965 issue of If magazine, then again in the February issue of a French version of Galaxie Magazine 2 years later. In the Bone was first published in the October 1966 issue of If magazine, then again in the same French variant of Galaxie. The Friendly Man was first published in the February 1951 issue of Astounding Science Fiction, and again in Vorsicht, Mensch, and Other Stories in August 1969. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Tiger Green. A man with hallucinations he cannot stand trying to strangle himself in a homemade straitjacket is not a pretty sight. But after a while, grimly thought Jerry McQuinn, the Star Scout's navigator, the ugly and terrible, seemed to backfire in effect, filling you with fury instead of harrowing you further. Men in crowds and packs could be stampeded briefly, but after a while, the individual among them would turn, get his back up, and slash back. At least, the hyper-stubborn individual in himself had finally so reacted. Determinedly, with fingers that fumbled from lack of sleep, he got the strangling man, Wally Blake, an assistant ecologist, untangled and into a position where it would be difficult for him to try to choke out his own life again. Then Jerry went out of the sickbay storeroom, leaving Wally and the other 7 men out of the Star Scouts' complement of 12 who were in total restraint. He was lightheaded from exhaustion, but a berserk something in him snarled like a cornered tiger and refused to break, like Wally and the others. When all's said and done, he thought half crazily, there's worse ways to come to the end of it than a last charge, win or lose, alone into the midst of all your enemies. Going down the corridor, the sight of another figure jolted him a little back toward common sense. Ben Ackham, the drive engineer, came trudging back from the airlock corridor with a flamethrower on his back. Soot etched darkly the lines on his once round face. "Get the hole cleared?" asked Jerry. Ben nodded exhaustedly. "There's more jungle on her every morning," he grunted. "Now those big thistles are starting to drip a corrosive liquid. The hole needs an anti-acid washing. I can't do it. I'm worn out." "We all are," said Jerry. His own 5'11" frame was down to 138 pounds. There was plenty of food. It was just that the 4 men left on their feet had no time to prepare it, and little enough time to eat it, prepared or not. Exploration Team 529, thought Jerry, had finally bitten off more than it could chew here on the second planet of star 83476. It was nobody's fault. It had been a gamble for Milt Johnson, the team captain, either way, to land or not to land. He had landed, and it had turned out bad. By such small things was the scale toward tragedy tipped. A communication problem with the natives, a native jungle evidently determined to digest the spaceship, and 8 of 12 men down with something like suicidal delirium tremens. Any 2 of these things the team could probably have handled, but not all 3 at once. Jerry and Ben reached the entrance of the control room together and peered in, looking for Milt Johnson. "Must be outside, talking to that native again," said Jerry. "Outside? Outside?" exploded Ben with a sudden snapping of frayed nerves. "Can't you say outside? Outside, like everybody else?" The berserk something in Jerry lunged to be free, but he caught it and hauled it back. "Get hold of yourself," he snapped. "Well, I wouldn't mind you sounding like a blasted Scotchman all the time," growled Ben, getting himself nevertheless somewhat under control. "It's just you always do it when I don't expect it. If the Lord wanted us all to sound alike, he'd have propped up the Tower of Babel," said Jerry wickedly. He was not particularly religious himself, but he knew Ben to be a table-thumping atheist. He had the satisfaction now of watching the other man bite his lips and control himself in his turn. Academically, however, Jerry thought, as they both headed out through the ship to find Milt, he could not really blame Ben. For Jerry, like many Scot-Canadians, appeared to speak a very Middle Western American sort of English most of the time, but only as long as he avoided such vocabulary items as house and out, which popped off Jerry's tongue as hoos and oot. However, every man aboard had his personal peculiarities. He had to get used to them. That was part of spaceship, in fact, part of human life. They emerged from the lock, rounded the nose of the spaceship, and found themselves in the neat little clearing on one side of the ship where the jungle paradoxically refused to grow. In this clearing stood the broad-shouldered figure of Milt Johnson, his whitish-blonde hair glinting in the yellow-white sunlight. Facing Milt was the thin, naked, and saddle-colored humanoid figure of one of the natives from the village, or whatever it was, about 20 minutes away by jungle trail. Between Milt and the native was the glittering metal console of the translator machine. "Let's try it once more," they heard Milt saying as they came up and stopped behind him. The native gabbled agreeably. "Yes, yes, try it again," translated the voice of the console. "I am Captain Milton Johnson. I am in authority over the crew of the ship you see before me." "Gladly would I not see it," replied the console on translation of the native's gamblings. "However, I am communicator, messenger to you sick ones." "I will call you communicator, then," began Milt. "Of course. What else could you call me?" "Please," said Milt wearily. "To get back to it, I also am a communicator." No, said the native. "You are not a communicator. It is the sickness that makes you talk this way." "But," said Milt, and Jerry saw the big white-haired captain swallow in an attempt to keep his temper, "you will notice I am communicating with you." No. "I see," said Milt patiently. "You mean we aren't communicating in the sense that we aren't understanding each other? We're talking, but you don't understand me?" No, I understand you perfectly." "Well," said Milt exhaustedly, "I don't understand you." "That is because you are sick." Milt blew out a deep breath and wiped his brow. "Forget that part of it, then," he said. "Many of my crew are upset by nightmares we all have been having. They are sick. But there are still 4 of us who are, well..." No, you are all sick," said Communicator earnestly. "But you should love what you call nightmares. All people love them." "Including you and your people?" "Of course. Love your nightmares. They will make you well. They will make the little bit of proper life in you grow and heal you." Ben snorted beside Jerry. Jerry could sympathize with the other man. The nightmares he had been having during his scant hours of sleep the past 2 weeks came back to his mind with the indescribably alien, terrifying sensation of drifting in a sort of environmental soup with identifiable things changing shape and identity constantly around him. Even pumped full of tranquilizers, he thought, which reminded Jerry. He had not taken his tranquilizers lately. When had he taken some last? Not since he woke up, in any case. Not since yesterday sometime, though that was now hard to believe. "Let's forget that too, then," Milt was saying. "Now, the jungle is growing all over our ship in spite of all we can do. You tell me your people can make the jungle do anything you want." "Yes, yes," said Communicator agreeably. "Then will you please stop it from growing all over our spaceship?" "We understand. It is your sickness, the poison, that makes you say this. Do not fear. We will never abandon you." Communicator looked almost ready to pat Milt consolingly on the head. "You are people who are more important than any cost. Soon you will grow and cast off your poisoned part and come to us." "But we can come to you right now," said Milt between his teeth. "In fact, we've come to your village 12 times. No, no. Communicator sounded distressed. "You approach, but you do not come. You have never come to us." Milt wiped his forehead with the back of a wide hand. "I will come back to your village now, with you," he said. "Would you like that?" he asked. "I would be so happy," said Communicator. "But you will not come. You say it, but you do not come." "All right, wait." About to take a hand transceiver from the console, Milt saw the other two men. "Jerry," he said, "you go this time. Maybe he'll believe it if it's you who goes to the village with him." "I've been there before, with you, the second time you went," objected Jerry. "And I've got to feed the men in restraint pretty soon," he added. "Try going again. That's all we can do. Try things. Ben and I'll feed the men," said Milt. Jerry, about to argue further, felt the pressure of a sudden, wordless, exhausted appeal from Milt. Milt's basic berserkedness must be just about ready to break loose, too, he realized. "All right," said Jerry. "Good," said Milt, looking grateful. "We have to keep trying. I should have lifted ship while I still had 5 well men to lift it with. Come on, Ben. You and I better go feed those men now before we fall asleep on our feet." 2. They went away around the nose of the ship. Jerry unhooked the little black and white transceiver that would radio relay his conversations with Communicator back to the console of the translator for sense-making during the trip. "Come on," he said to Communicator, and led off down the pleasantly wide jungle trail toward the native village. They passed from under the little patch of open sky above the clearing and into green-roofed stillness. All about them, massive limbs, branches, ferns, and vines intertwined in a majestic maze of growing things. Small flying creatures, looking half animal and half insect, flittered among the branches overhead. Some larger, more animal-like creatures sat on the heavier limbs and moaned off-key like abandoned puppies. Jerry's head spun with his weariness, and the green over his head seemed to close down on him like a net flung by some giant, crazy fisherman to take him captive. He was suddenly and bitterly reminded of the team's high hopes the day they had set down on this world. No other team or group had yet to turn up any kind of alien life much more intelligent than an anthropoid ape. Now they, Team 529, had not only uncovered an intelligent, evidently semi-cultured alien people, but an alien people eager to establish relations with the humans and communicate. Here, 2 weeks later, the natives were still apparently just as eager to communicate, but what they said made no sense. Nor did it help that, with the greatest of patience and kindness, Communicator and his kind seemed to consider that it was the humans who were irrational and uncommunicative. Nor That meanwhile, that the jungle seemed to be mounting a specifically directed attack on the human spaceship, nor that the nightmare afflicting the humans had already laid low 8 of the 12 crew and were grinding the 4 left on their feet down to a choice between suicidal delirium or collapse from exhaustion. It was a miracle, thought Jerry, lightheartedly trudging through the jungle, that the 4 of them had been able to survive as long as they had, a miracle based probably on some individual chance peculiarity of strength that the other men in straitjackets lacked. Although, thought Jerry now, that strength that was had so far defied analysis. Dizzily, like a man in a high fever, he considered their 4 surviving personalities in his mind's eye. They were, he thought, the 4 men of the team with what you might call the biggest mental crotchets, or ornery streaks. Take the 4th member of the group, the Medician, Arthur Loy, who had barely stuck his nose out of the sickbay lab in the last 48 hours. Not only because he was the closest thing to an MD aboard the ship, was Art still determined to put the 8 restrained men back on their feet again. It just happened, in addition, that Art considered himself the only true professional man aboard, and was not the kind to admit any inability to the lesser mortals about him. And Milt Johnson. Milt made an excellent captain. He was a tower of strength, a great man for making decisions. The only thing was that, having decided, Milt could hardly be brought to consider the remote possibility that anyone else might have wanted to decide differently. Ben Ackham was another matter. Ben hated religion and loved machinery, and the jungle surrounding was attacking his spaceship. In fact, Jerry was willing to bet that by the time he got back, Ben would be washing the hull with an acid counteractant in spite of what he had told Jerry earlier. And himself? Jerry? Jerry shook his head woozily. It was hard to be self-analytical after 10 days of 3 and 4 hours sleep per 20. He had what his grandmother had once described as the curse of the Gale, black stubbornness and red rages. All of these traits, in all 4 of them, had normally been buried safely below the surfaces of their personalities and had only colored them as individuals. But now, the last 2 weeks had worn those surfaces down to basic personality bedrock. Jerry shoved the thought out of his mind. "Well," he said, turning to Communicator, "we're almost to your village now. You can't say someone didn't come with you this time." Communicator gabbled. The transceiver in Jerry's hand translated. "Alas," the native said, "but you are not with me." "Cut it out," said Jerry wearily. "I'm right here beside you." "No," said Communicator. "You accompany me, but you are not here. You are back with your dead things." "You mean the ship and the rest of it?" asked Jerry. "There is no ship," said Communicator. "A ship must have grown and been alive. Your thing has always been dead, but we will save you." 3. They came out of the path at last into a clearing dotted with whitish, pumpkin-like shells some 10 feet in height above the brown earth in which they were half buried. Wide cracks in the outcurving sides gave view of tangled roots and plants inside, among which other natives could be seen moving about, scratching, tasting, and making holes in the vegetable surfaces. "Well," said Jerry, making an effort to speak cheerfully, "here I am." "You are not here." The berserk tigerishness in Jerry leaped up unawares and took him by the inner throat. For a long second he looked at Communicator through a red haze. Communicator gazed back patiently, evidently unaware how close he was to having his neck broken by a pair of human hands. "Look," said Jerry, slowly between his teeth, getting himself under control. "If you will just tell me what to do to join you and your people here, I will do it." "That is good." "Then," said Jerry, still with both hands on the inner fury that fought to tear loose inside him, "what do I do?" "But you know." The enthusiasm that had come into Communicator a moment before wavered visibly. "You must get rid of the dead things and set yourself free to grow inside. Then, after you have grown, your unsick self will bring you here to join us." Jerry stared back. "Patience," he said harshly to himself. "Grow? How? In what way?" "But you have a little bit of proper life in you," explained Communicator. "Not much, of course, but if you will rid yourself of dead things and concentrate on what you call nightmares, it will grow and force out the poison of the dead life in you. The proper life and the nightmares are the hope for you." "Wait a minute!" Jerry's exhaustion-fogged brain cleared suddenly and nearly miraculously at the sudden surge of excitement into his bloodstream. "This proper life you talk about, does it have something to do with the nightmares?" "Of course. How could you have what you call nightmares without a little proper life in you to give them to you? As the proper life grows, you will cease to fight so against the nightmares." Communicator continued to talk earnestly, but Jerry's spinning brain was flying off on a new tangent. What was it he had been thinking earlier about tranquilizers? That he had not taken any himself for some time? Then what about the nightmares in his last 4 hours of sleep? He must have had them. He remembered now that he had had them. But evidently they had not bothered him as much as before, at least not enough to send him scrambling for tranquilizers to dull the dream's weird impact on him. "Communicator!" Jerry grabbed at the thin, leathery-skinned arm of the native. "Have I been growing?" "I do not know, of course," said the native courteously. "I profoundly hope so. Have you?" "Excuse me," gulped Jerry. "I've got to get out of here. Back to the ship." He turned and raced back up the trail. Some 20 minutes later, he burst into the clearing before the ship to find an ominous silence hanging over everything. Only the faint rustle and hissing from the ever-growing jungle swallowing up the ship sounded on his eardrums. "Milt! Ben!" he shouted, plunging into the ship. "Art!" A hail from farther down the main corridor reassured him, and he followed it up to find all three unrestrained members of the crew in the sick bay. But Jerry brought himself up short, his throat closing on him. There was a figure on the table. "Who—" began Jerry. Milt Johnson turned around to face him. The captain's big body mercifully hid most of the silent form on the table. "Wally Blake," said Milt emptily. "He managed to strangle himself after all. Got twisted up in his restraint jacket. Ben and I heard him thumping around in there, but by the time we got to him, it was too late. Art's doing an autopsy." "Not exactly an autopsy," came the soft Virginia voice of the Medicean from beyond Milt. "Just looking for something I suspected, and here it is." Milt spun about, and Jerry pushed between the big captain and Ben. He found himself looking at the back of a human head from which a portion of the skull had been removed. What he saw before him was a small expanse of whitish, soft inner tissue that was the brainstem, and fastened to it, almost like a grape growing there, was a small purplish mass. Art indicated the purple shape with the tip of a sharp surgical instrument. "There," he said, "and I bet we've each got one." "What is it?" asked Ben's voice, hushed and a little nauseated. I don't know, said Art harshly. How the devil would I be able to tell? But I found organisms in the bloodstreams of those of us I've taken blood samples from. Organisms like spores that look like this, only smaller, microscopic in size. You didn't tell me that, said Milt, turning quickly to face him. What was the point? Art turned toward the team captain. Jerry saw that the Medicin's long face was almost bloodless. I didn't know what they were. I thought if I kept looking, I might know more. Then I could have something positive to tell you, as well as the bad news. But it's no use now. Why do you say that? Snapped Milt. Because it's the truth. Art's face seemed to slide apart, go loose and waxy with defeat. As long as it was something non-physical we were fighting, there was some hope we could throw it off. But you see what's going on inside us. We're being changed physically. That's where the nightmares come from. You can't overcome a physical change with an effort of will. What about the grotto at Lourdes? Asked Jerry. His head was whirling strangely with a mass of ideas. His own great-grandfather, the family story came back to mind, had been judged by his physician in 1896 to have advanced pulmonary tuberculosis. Going home from the doctor's office, Simon Fraser McQuinn had decided that he could not afford to have tuberculosis at this time, that he would not, therefore, have tuberculosis at all, and he had dismissed the matter fully from his mind. 1 year later, examined by the same physician, he had no signs of tuberculosis whatsoever. But in this present moment, Art, curling up in his chair at the end of the table, seemed not to have heard Jerry's question, and Jerry was suddenly reminded of the question that had brought him pelting back from the native village. Is it growing? I mean, was it growing when Wally strangled himself? That growth on his brain? He asked. Art roused himself. Growing? He repeated dully. He climbed to his feet and picked up an instrument. He investigated the purple mass for a moment. No, he said, dropping the instrument wearily and falling back into his chair. Looks like its outer layer has died and started to be reabsorbed, I think. He put his head in his hands. I'm not qualified to answer such questions. I'm not trained. Who is? Demanded Milt, grimly, looming over the table and the rest of them. And we're reaching the limit of our strength as well as the limits of what we know. We're done for, muttered Ben. His eyes were glazed, looking at the dissected body on the table. It's not my fault. Catch him! Catch Art! Shouted Jerry, leaping forward. But he was too late. The Medician had been gradually curling up in his chair since he had sat down in it again. Now he slipped out of it to the floor, rolled in a ball, and lay still. Leave him alone. Milt's large hand caught Jerry and held him back. He may as well lie there as someplace else. He got to his feet. Ben's right. We're done for. Done for? Jerry stared at the big man. The words he had just heard were words he would never have imagined hearing from Milt. Yes, said Milt. He seemed somehow to be speaking from a long distance off. Listen, said Jerry. The tigerishness inside him had woken at Milt's words. It tugged and snarled against the words of defeat from the captain's lips. We're winning. We aren't losing. Quit it, Jerry, said Ben, dully, from the far end of the room. Quit it? Jerry swung on the engineer. You lost your temper with me before I went down to the village about the way I said oot. How could you lose your temper if you were full of tranquilizers? I haven't been taking any myself, and I feel better because of it. Don't tell me you've been taking yours. And that means we're getting stronger than the nightmares. The tranquilizers have been making me sick, if you must know. That's why I haven't been taking them. Ben broke off, his face graying. He pointed a shaking finger at the purplish mass. I'm being changed. That's why they made me sick. I'm changing already. His voice rose toward a scream. Don't you see? It's changing me. He broke off, suddenly screaming and leaping at Milt with clawing fingers. We're all changing, and it's your fault for bringing the ship down here. You did it! Milt's huge fist slammed into the side of the smaller man's jaw, driving him to the floor beside the still shape of the Medicean, where he lay quivering and sobbing. Slowly, Milt lifted his gaze from the fallen man and faced Jerry. It was the standard 72 degrees Fahrenheit in the room, but Jerry saw perspiration standing out on Milt's calm face as if he had just stepped out of a steam bath. But he may be right, said Milt emotionlessly. His voice seemed to come from the far end of some lightless tunnel. We may be changing under the influence of those growths right now, each of us. Milt, said Jerry sharply. But Milt's face never changed. It was large and calm and pale and drenched with sweat. Now's the last time we ought to give up. We're starting to understand it now. I tell you, the thing is to meet Communicator and the other natives head on. Head to head, we can crack them wide open. One of us has to go down to that village. No, I'm the captain, said Milt, his voice unchanged. I'm responsible, and I'll decide. We can't lift ship with less than 5 men, and there's only 2 of us, you and I, actually left. I can't risk one of us coming under the influence of the growth in him and going over to the alien side. Going over? Jerry stared at him. That's what all this has been for. The jungle, the natives, the nightmare. They want to take us over. Sweat ran down Milt's cheeks and dropped off his chin while he continued to talk tonelessly and gaze straight ahead. They'll send us, what's left of us, back against our own people. I can't let that happen. We'll have to destroy ourselves so there's nothing for them to use. Milt, said Jerry. No. Milt swayed faintly on his feet like a tall tree under a wind too high to be felt on the ground at its base. We can't risk leaving ship or crew. We'll blow the ship up with ourselves in it. Blow up my ship! It was a wild animal scream from the floor at their feet, and Ben Ackham rose from almost under the table like a demented wildcat, aiming for Milt's jugular vein. So unexpected and powerful was the attack that the big captain tottered and fell. With a noise like worrying dogs, they rolled together under the table. The chained tiger inside Jerry broke its bonds and flung free. He turned and ducked through the door into the corridor. It was a heavy pressure door with a wheel lock, activating metal dogs to seal it shut in case of a whole blowout and sudden loss of air. Jerry slammed the door shut and spun the wheel. The dogs snicked home. Snatching down the portable fire extinguisher hanging on the wall alongside, Jerry dropped the foam container on the floor and jammed the metal nozzle of its hose between a spoke of the locking wheel and the unlocking stop on the door beneath it. He paused. There was silence inside the sickbay lab. Then the wheel jerked against the nozzle and the door tried to open. "What's going on?" demanded the voice of Milt. There was a pause. "Jerry, what's going on out there? Open up!" A wild, crazy impulse to hysterical laughter rose inside Jerry without warning. It took all his willpower to choke it back. "You're locked in, Milt," he said. "Jerry!" The wheel spoke, clicked against the jamming metal nozzle in a futile effort to turn. "Open up! That's an order!" "Sorry, Milt," said Jerry softly and lightheadedly. "I'm not ready yet to burn the hoose about my ears. This business of you wanting to blow up the ship's the same sort of impulse to suicide that got Wally and the rest. I'm off to face the natives now and let them have their way with me. I'll be back later to let you out. Jerry! Jerry heard Milt's voice behind him as he went off down the corridor. Jerry! There was a fusillade of pounding fists against the door, growing fainter as Jerry moved away. Don't you see? That growth in you is finally getting you. Jerry, come back. Don't let them take over one of us. Jerry. Jerry left the noise and the ship together behind him as he stepped out of the airlock. The jungle, he saw, was covering the ship's hull again, already hiding it for the most part. He went on out to the translator console and began taking off his clothes. When he was completely undressed, he unhooked the transceiver he had brought back from the native village, slung it on a loop of his belt, and hung the belt around his neck. He headed off down the trail toward the village, wincing a little as the soles of his shoeless feet came into contact with pebbles along the way. When he got to the village clearing, a naked shape he recognized as that of Communicator tossed up its arms in joy and came running to him. Well, said Jerry, I've grown. I've got rid of the poison of dead things and the sickness. Here I am to join you. At last, gabbled Communicator. Other natives were running up. Throw away the dead thing around your neck. I still need it to understand you, said Jerry. I guess I need a little help to join you all the way. Help? We will help, cried Communicator. But you must throw that away. You have rid yourself of the dead things that you kept wrapped around your limbs and body, gabbled Communicator. Now rid yourself of the dead thing hanging about your neck. But I tell you, if I do that, objected Jerry, I won't be able to understand you when you talk or make you understand me. Throw it away. It is poisoning you. Throw it away, said Communicator. By this time, 3 or 4 more natives had come up and others were headed for the gathering. Shortly you will understand all, and all will understand you. Throw it away. Throw it away, chorused the other natives. Well, said Jerry. Reluctantly, he took off the belt with the transceiver and dropped it. Communicator gabbled unintelligibly. Come with me, translated the transceiver like a faint and tinny echo from the ground where it landed. Communicator took hold of Jerry's hand and drew him toward the nearest whitish structure. Jerry swallowed unobtrusively. It was one thing to make up his mind to do this. It was something else again to actually do it. But he let himself be led to and in through a crack in the structure. Inside, the place smelled rather like a mixture of a root cellar and a hayloft, earthy and fragrant at the same time. Communicator drew him in among the waist-high tangle of roots rising and re-entering the packed earth floor. The other natives swarmed after them. Close to the center of the floor, they reached a point where the roots were too thick to allow them to pick their way any further. The roots rose and tangled into a mat, the irregular surface of which was about 3 feet off the ground. Communicator patted the root surface and gabbled agreeably. You want me to get up there? Jerry swallowed again, then gritted his teeth as the chained fury in him turned suddenly upon himself. There was nothing worse, he snarled at himself, than a man who was long on planning a course of action, but short on carrying it out. Awkwardly, he clambered up onto the matted surface of the roots. They gave irregularly under him, and their rough surfaces scraped his knees and hands. The natives gabbled, and he felt leather hands urging him to stretch out and lie down on his back. He did so. The root scored and poked the tender skin of his back. It was exquisitely uncomfortable. "Now what?" he gasped. He turned his head to look at the natives and saw that green tendrils, growing rapidly from the root mass, were winding about and garlanding the arms and legs of Communicator and several other of the natives standing by. A sudden pricking at his left wrist made him look down. Green garlands were twining around his own wrists and ankles, sending wire-thin tendrils into his skin. In unconscious reflex of panic, he tried to heave upward, but the green bonds held him fast. "Gabble, gabble, gabble," warbled Communicator reassuringly. With sudden alarm, Jerry realized that the green tendrils were growing right into the arms and legs of the natives as well. He was abruptly conscious of further prickings in his own arms and legs. "What's going on?" he started to say, but found his tongue had gone unnaturally thick and unmanageable. A wave of dizziness swept over him, as if a powerful general anesthetic was taking hold. The interior of the structure seemed to darken, and he felt as if he was swooping away toward its ceiling on the long swing of some monster pendulum. It swung him on into darkness and nightmare. It was the same old nightmare, but more so. It was nightmare experienced awake instead of asleep, and the difference was that he had no doubt about the fact that he was experiencing what he was experiencing, nor any tucked-away certainty that waking would bring him out of it. Once more he floated through a changing soup of uncertainty, himself a changing part of it. It was not painful, it was not even terrifying, but it was hideous. It was an affront to nature. He was not himself. He was a thing, a part of the whole, and he must reconcile himself to being so. He must accept it. Reconcile himself to it? No! It was not possible for the unbending, solitary, individualistic part that was him to do so, but accept it? Maybe. Jerry set a jaw that was no longer a jaw and felt the determination in him to blast through, to comprehend this incomprehensible thing, become hard and undeniable as a sword point of tungsten steel. He drove through, and abruptly the soup fell into order. It slid into focus like a blurred scene before the gaze of a badly myopic man who finally gets his spectacles before his eyes. Suddenly, Jerry was aware that what he observed was a scene not just before his eyes, but before his total awareness. And it was not the interior of the structure where he lay on a bed of roots, but the whole planet. It was a landscape of factories, countless factories, interconnected, intersupplying, integrated. It lacked only that he find his own working place among them. "Now," said this scene, "this is the sane universe, the way it really is. Reconcile yourself to it." "The hell I will." It was the furious, unbending, solitary, individualistic part that was essentially him, speaking again. Not just speaking, roaring, snarling its defiance like a tiger on a hillside. And the scene went pop. Jerry opened his eyes. He sat up. The green shoots around and in his wrists and ankles pulled pricklingly at him, but they were already dying and not able to hold him. He swung his legs over the edge of the mat of roots and stood down. Communicator and the others who were standing there backed fearfully away from him, gabbling. He understood their gabbling no better than before, but now he could read the emotional overtones in it. And those overtones were now of horror and disgust, overlying a wild atavistic panic and terror. He walked forward. They scuttled away before him, gabbling, and he walked through the nearest crack in the wall of the structure and out into the sunlight, toward the transceiver and the belt where he had dropped them. "Monster!" screamed the transceiver tinnily, faithfully translating the gabbling of the communicator, who was following a few steps behind like a small dog barking behind a larger. "Brute! Savage! Unclean!" It kept up a steady denunciation. Jerry turned to face communicator, and the native tensed for flight. "You know what I'm waiting for," said Jerry, almost smiling, hearing the transceiver translate his words into gabbling, though it was not necessary. As he had said, communicator knew what he was waiting for. Communicator cursed a little longer in his own tongue, then went off into one of its structures, and returned with a handful of what looked like lengths of green vine. He dropped them on the ground before Jerry and backed away, cautiously, gabbling. "Now will you go, and never come back? Never?" "We'll see," said Jerry. He picked up the lengths of green vine and turned away up the path to the ship. The natives he passed on his way out of the clearing huddled away from him and gabbled as he went. When he stepped back into the clearing before the ship, he saw that most of the vegetation touching or close to the ship was already brown and dying. He went on into the ship, carefully avoiding the locked sickbay door, and wound lengths of the green vine around the wrists of each of the men in restraints. Then he sat down to await results. He had never been so tired in his life. The minute he touched the chair, his eyes started to close. He struggled to his feet and forced himself to pace the floor until the green vines, which had already sent hair-thin tendrils into the ulnar arteries of the arms around which they were wrapped, pumped certain inhibitory chemicals into the bloodstreams of the 7 men. When the men started to blink their eyes and look about sensibly, he went to work to unfasten the homemade straitjackets that had held them prisoner. When he had released the last one, he managed to get out his final message before collapsing. "Take the ship up," croaked Jerry. "Then let yourself into the sick bay and wrap a vine piece around the wrists of Milt and Art and Ben. Ship up first. Then when you're safely in space, take care of them. In the sick bay. Do it the other way and you'll never see Earth again." They crowded around him with questions. He waved them off, slumping into one of the abandoned bunks. "Ship up," he croaked. "Then release and fix the others. Ask me later. Later." And that was all he remembered then. 4. At some indefinite time later, not quite sure whether he had woken by himself or whether someone else had wakened him, Jerry swam back up to consciousness. He was vaguely aware that he'd been sleeping a long time, and his body felt sane again, but weak as the body of a man after a long illness. He blinked and saw the large face of Milt Johnson, partly obscured by a cup of something. Milt was seated in a chair by the side of the bunk Jerry lay in, and the team captain was offering the cup of steaming black liquid to Jerry. Slowly, Jerry understood that this was coffee, and he struggled up on one elbow to take the cup. He drank from it slowly for a little while Milt watched and waited. "Do you realize," said Milt at last, when Jerry finally put down the 3/4 empty cup on the nightstand by the bunk, "that what you did in locking me in the sick bay was mutiny?" Jerry swallowed. Even his vocal cords seemed drained of strength and limp. "You realize," he croaked, "what would have happened if I hadn't? You took a chance. You followed a wild hunch." "No hunch," said Jerry. He cleared his throat. Art found that growth on Wally's brain had quit growing before Wally killed himself, and I'd been getting along without tranquilizers, handling the nightmares better than I had with them. It could have been the growth in your own brain, said Milt, taking over and running you, working better on you than it had on Wally. Working better? Talk sense, said Jerry, weakly, too pared down by the past 2 weeks to care whether school kept or not, in the matter of service courtesy to a superior. The nightmares had broken Wally down to where we had to wrap him in a straitjacket. They hadn't even knocked me off my feet. If Wally's physiological processes had fought the alien invasion to a standstill, then I, you, Art, and Ben, all of us, had to be doing even better. Besides, I'd figured out what the aliens were after. What were they after? Milt looked strangely at him. Curing us of something we didn't have when we landed, but they thought we had. And what was that? Insanity, said Jerry grimly. Milt's blonde eyebrows went up. He opened his mouth as if to say something disbelieving, then closed it again. When he did speak, it was quite calmly and humbly. They thought, he asked, communicators' people thought that we were insane, and they could cure us? Jerry laughed, not cheerfully, but grimly. You saw that jungle around us back there? He asked. That was a factory complex, an infinitely complex factory complex. You saw their village with those tangles of roots inside the big whitish shells? That was a highly diversified laboratory. Milt's blue eyes slowly widened as Jerry watched. You don't mean that seriously? Said Milt at last. That's right. Jerry drained the cup and set it aside. Their technology's based on organic chemistry, the way ours is on the physical sciences. By our standards, they're chemical wizards. How'd you like to try changing the mind of an alien organism by managing to grow an extra part onto his brain, the way they tried to do to us humans? To them, it was the simplest way of convincing us. Milt stared again. Finally, he shook his head. Why? He said. Why would they want to change our minds? Because their philosophy, their picture of life, and the universe around them grew out of a chemically oriented science, answered Jerry. The result is they see all life as part of a closed, interacting chemical circuit with no loose ends, with every living thing, intelligent or not, a part of the whole. Well, you saw it for yourself in your nightmare. That's the cosmos as they see it. And to them, it's beautiful. But why didn't they want us to see it the way they did? Out of sheer kindness, said Jerry, and laughed barkingly. According to their cosmology, there's no such thing as an alien. Therefore, we weren't alien, just sick in the head, poisoned by the lumps of metal like the ship and the translator we claimed were so important, and our clothes and everything else we had. The kind thing was to cure and rescue us. Now, wait a minute, said Milt. They saw those things of ours work. What's the fact they worked got to do with it? What you don't understand, Milt, said Jerry, lying back gratefully on the bunk, is that communicators' people's minds were closed. Not just unconvinced, not just refusing to see, but closed. Sealed and welded shut from prehistoric beginnings right down to the present. The fact our translator worked meant nothing to them. According to their cosmology, it shouldn't work, so it didn't. Any stray phenomena tending to prove it did were simply the product of diseased minds. Jerry paused to emphasize the statement, and his eyes drifted shut. The next thing he knew, Milt was shaking him. "Wake up!" Milt was shouting at him. "You could dope off after you've explained. I'm not going to have any crew back in straitjackets again, just 'cause you were too sleepy to warn me they'd revert." "Won't revert," said Jerry thickly. He roused himself. "Those lengths of vine released chemicals into their bloodstreams to destroy what was left of the growths. I wouldn't leave until I got them from Communicator." Jerry struggled up on one elbow again. "And after a short walk in a human brain, mine, he and his people couldn't get us out of sight and forgotten fast enough." "Why?" Milt shook him again as Jerry's eyelids sagged. "Why should getting their minds hooked in with yours shake them up so?" Bust their cosmology open. Quit shaking. I'm awake." "Why did it bust them wide open?" "Remember how it was for you with the nightmares?" said Jerry. "The other way around. Think back about when you slept. There you were, a lone atom of humanity, caught up in a nightmare like one piece of stew meat in a vat, stewing all life together. Just one single chemical bit with no independent existence, and no existence at all except as part of the whole. Remember?" He saw Milt shiver slightly. "It was like being swallowed up by a soft machine," said the team captain in a small voice. "I remember." "All right," he said. Jerry's heavy eyes closed. Then the other man's voice spoke, still close by his ear. "But," said Milt, "I still think you took a chance, going down to butt heads with the natives that way. What if Communicator and the rest had been able to stand exposure to your mind? You'd locked me in, and the other men were in restraint. Our whole team would have been part of that stewing vat." "Not a chance," said Jerry. "You can't be sure of that." "Yes, I can." Jerry heard his own voice sounding harshly beyond the darkness of his closed eyelids. "It wasn't just that I knew my cosmological view was too tough for them. It was the fact that their minds were closed in the vat, that they had no freedom to change and adapt themselves to anything new." "What's that got to do with it?" demanded the voice of Milt. "Everything," said Jerry. "Their point of view only made us more uncomfortable. But our point of view, being individually adaptable and open, threatened to destroy the very laws of existence as they saw them. An open mind can always stand a closed one if it has to, by making room for it in the general picture. But a closed mind can't stand it near an open one without risking immediate and complete destruction in its own terms. In a closed mind, there's no more room." He stopped speaking and slowly exhaled a weary breath. "Now," he said, without opening his eyes, "will you finally get out of here and let me sleep?" For a long second more, there was silence. Then he heard a chair scrape softly, and the muted steps of Milt tiptoeing away. With another sigh, at last Jerry relaxed and let consciousness slip from him. He slept. As sleep the boar upon the plain, the hawk upon the crag, and the tiger on the hill. In the Bone. Personally, his name was Harry Brennan. Officially, he was the John Paul Jones, which consisted of $4 billion worth of irresistible equipment, the latest and best of human science, designed to spread its 4,000 components out through some 15 cubic meters of space under ordinary conditions, designed also to stretch across light years under extraordinary conditions, such as sending an emergency messenger component home, or to clump into a single magnetic unit in order to shift through space and explore the galaxy. Both officially and personally, but most of all personally, he represents a case in point. The case is one having to do with the relative importance of the made thing and its maker. It was, as we know, the armored horsemen who dominated the early wars of the Middle Ages in Europe. But knowing this, it is still wise to remember that it was not the iron shell that made the combination of man and metal terrible to the enemy, but rather the essentially naked man inside the shell. Later, French knights, depending on their armor, went down before the cloth-yard shafts of unarmored footmen with bows at Crécy and Poitiers. And what holds true for armor holds true for the latest developments of our science as well. It is not the spacecraft or the laser on which we will find ourselves depending when a time of ultimate decision comes, but the naked men within and behind these things. When that time comes, those who rank the made thing before its maker will die as the French knights died at Crécy and Poitiers. This is a law of nature as wide as the universe, which Harry Brennan, totally unsuspecting, was to discover once more for us in his personal capacity. Personally, he was in his mid-20s, unremarkable except for 2 years of special training with the John Paul Jones and his superb physical condition. He was 5'11", 172 pounds, with a round, cheerful face under his brown, crew-cut hair. I was public relations director of the project that sent him out, and I was there with the rest to slap him on the back the day he left. "Don't get lost now," said someone. Harry grinned. "The way you guys built this thing?" he answered. "If I got lost, the galaxy would just have to shift itself around to get me back on plot." There was an unconscious arrogance hidden in that answer, but no one marked it at the time. It was not the hour of suspicions. He climbed into the 12-foot-tall control suit that, with his separate living tank, were the main components of the John Paul Jones, and took off. Up in orbit, he spent some 32 hours testing to make sure all the several thousand other component parts were responding properly. Then he left the solar system. He clumped together his components, made his first shift to orbit Procyon, and from there commenced his explorations of the stars. In the next 9 weeks, he accumulated literally amazing amounts of new information about the nearby stars and their solar systems. And this is an even better index of his success, located 4 new worlds on which men could step with never a spacesuit or even a water canteen to sustain them. Worlds so alike Earth in gravity, atmosphere, and even flora and fauna that they could be colonized tomorrow. Those were his first 4 worlds. On the 5th, he encountered his fate, a fate for which he was unconsciously ripe. The fact was, the medical men and psychologists had overlooked a factor having to do with the effect of Harry's official John Paul Jones self upon his entirely human personal self, and over 9 weeks this effect changed Harry without his ever having suspected it. You see, nothing seemed barred to him. He could cross light years by touching a few buttons. He could send a sensing element into the core of the hottest star, into the most poisonous planetary atmospheres, or crushing gravities, to look around as if he were down there in person. From orbit, he could crack open a mountain, burn off a forest, or vaporize a section of ice cap in search of information just by tapping the energy of a nearby sun. And so, subtly, the unconscious arrogance born during 2 years of training that should have been noted in him at takeoff from Earth emerged and took him over, until he felt that there was nothing he could not do, that all things must give way to him, that he was, in effect, master of the universe. The day may come when a man like Harry Brennan may hold such a belief and be justified, but not yet. On the fifth Earth-like world he discovered, world 1242 in his records, Harry encountered the proof that his belief was unjustified. 2. The world was one which, from orbit, seemed to be the best of all the planets which he had discovered were suitable for human settlement, and he was about to go down to its surface personally in the control suit when his instruments picked out something already down there. It was a squat, metallic pyramid about the size of a fourplex apartment building, and it was radiating on a number of interesting frequencies. Around its base there was mechanical movement and an area of cleared ground. Further out in the native forest were treaded vehicles taking samples of the soil, rock, and vegetation. Harry had been trained for all conceivable situations, including an encounter with other intelligent space-going life. Automatically, he struck a specific button, and immediately a small torpedo shape leaped away to shift through alternate space and back to Earth with the information so far obtained. And a pale, thin beam reached up and out from the pyramid below. Harry's emergency messenger component ceased to exist. Shaken, but not yet really worried, Harry struck back instantly with all the power his official self could draw from the GO-type sun nearby. The power was funneled by some action below directly into the pyramid itself, and it vanished there as indifferently as the single glance of a sunbeam upon a leaf. Harry's mind woke suddenly to some understanding of what he had encountered. He reached for the controls to send the John Paul Jones shifting into the alternate universe and away. His hands never touched the controls. From the pyramid below, a blue lance of light reached up to paralyze him, select the control suit from among the other components, and send it tumbling to the planetary surface below like a swatted insect. But the suit had been designed to protect its occupant, whether he himself was operative or not. At 1,500 feet, the drag chute broke free, looking like a silver cloth candle snuffer in the sunlight, and at 500 feet, the retro rockets cut in. The suit tumbled to Earth among some trees 2 kilometers from the pyramid, with Harry inside, bruised but released from his paralysis. From the pyramid, a jagged arm of something like white lightning lashed the ground as far as the suit, and the suit's outer surface glowed cherry red. Inside, the temperature suddenly shot up 50 degrees. Instinctively, Harry hit the panic button available to him inside the suit. The suit split down the center like an overcooked frankfurter and spat Harry out. He rolled among the brush and fern-like ground cover, 6 or 7 meters from the suit. From the distant pyramid, the lightning lashed the suit, breaking it up. The headpiece rolled drunkenly aside, turning the dark gape of its interior toward Harry like the hollow of an empty skull. In the dimness of that hollow, Harry saw the twinkle of his control buttons. The lightning vanished. A yellow lightness filled the air about Harry and the dismembered suit. There was a strange quivering to the yellowness, and Harry half smelled, half tasted the sudden flat bite of ozone. In the headpiece of a button clicked without being touched, and the suit speaker, still radio-connected with the recording tank in orbit, spoke aloud in Harry's voice. "Orbit," it said. "Into. Going." These were in reverse order, the last 3 words Harry had recorded before sighting the pyramid. Now, swiftly gaining speed, the speaker began to recite backwards, word for word, everything Harry had said into it in 9 weeks. Faster it went, and faster, until it mounted to a chatter, a gabble, and finally a whine pushing against the upper limits of Harry's auditory register. Suddenly, it stopped. The little clearing about Harry was full of silence. Only the odd and distant creaking of something that might have been a rubbing branch or an alien insect came to Harry's ears. Then the speaker spoke once more. "Animal," it said flatly in Harry's calm, recorded voice, and went on to pick further words from the recordings. "Best. You were an animal, wrapped in maid clothing. I have stripped you back to animal again. Live, beast." Then the yellowness went out of the air, and the taste of ozone with it. The headpiece of the dismembered suit grinned, empty as old bones in the sunlight. Harry scrambled to his feet and ran wildly away through the trees and brush. He ran in panic and utter fear, his lungs gasping, his feet pounding the alien earth, until the earth, the trees, the sky itself swam about him from exhaustion, and he fell tumbling to earth and away into the dark haven of unconsciousness. When he woke, it was night, and he could not quite remember where he was or why. His thoughts seemed numb and unimportant. But he was cold, so he blundered about until he found the standing half-trunk of a lightning-blasted tree and crept into the burned hollow of its interior, raking frill-edged, alien leaves about him out of some half-forgotten insect, until his own body warmth in the leaves formed a cocoon of comfort about him, and he slept. From then on began a period in which nothing was very clear. It was as if his mind had huddled itself away somehow like a wounded animal and refused to think. There was no past or future, only the endless now. If now was warm, it had always been warm. If dark, it had always been dark. He learned to smell water from a distance and go to it when he was thirsty. He put small things in his mouth to taste them. If they tasted good, he ate them. If he got sick afterwards, he did not eat them again. Gradually, blindly, the world about him began to take on a certain order. He came to know where there were plants with portions he could eat, where there were small creatures he could catch and pull apart and eat, and where there was water. He did not know how lucky he was in the sheer chance of finding flora and fauna on an alien world that were edible, let alone nourishing. He did not realize that he had come down on a plateau in the tropical highlands, with little variation in day and night temperature, and no large native predators which might have attacked him. None of this he knew, nor would it have made any difference to him if he had, for the intellectual center of his brain had gone on vacation, so to speak, and refused to be called back. He was, in fact, a victim of severe psychological shock, the shock of someone who had come to feel himself absolute master of a universe, and who then, in a few short seconds, had been cast down from that high estate by something or someone inconceivably greater, into the state of a beast of the field. But still, he could not be a true beast of the field in spite of the fact his intellectual processes had momentarily abdicated. His perceptive abilities still worked. His eyes could not help noting, even if incuriously, the progressive drying of the vegetation, the day-by-day shifting in the points of setting and rising of the sun. Slowly, instinctively, the eternal moment that held him stretched and lengthened until he began to perceive divisions within it, a difference between now and was, between now and will be. 3. The day came at last when he saw himself. 100 times he had crouched by the water to drink, and, lowering his lips to its surface, seen color and shape rising to meet him. The 100th and something time, he checked, a few inches above the liquid plains, staring at what he saw. For several long seconds it made no sense to him. Then, at first slowly, then with a rush like pain flooding back on someone rousing from the anesthesia of unconsciousness, he recognized what he saw. Those were eyes at which he stared, sunken and dark-circled under a dirty tangle of hair. That was a nose jutting between gaunt and sunken cheeks above a mouth, and there was a chin, naked only because once an ultrafine laser had burned out the 1,001 roots of the beard that grew on it. That was a man he saw. Himself. He jerked back like someone who has come face to face with the devil, but he returned eventually because he was thirsty to drink and see himself again. And so, gradually, he got used to the sight of himself. So it was that memory started to return to him, but it did not come back quickly or all at once. It returned instead by jerks and sudden, partial revelations, until finally the whole memory of what had happened was back in his conscious mind again. But he was really not a man again. He was still essentially what the operator of the pyramid had broken him down into. He was still an animal. Only the memory and imaginings of a man had returned to live like a prisoner in a body that went on reacting and surviving in the bestial way it had come to regard as natural. But his animal peace was broken, for his imprisoned mind worked now. With the control suit broken up, he had returned to the spot of its destruction many times to gaze beast-like at the rusting parts. His mind knew he was a prisoner, alone on this alien world until he died. To know that was not so bad, but remembering this much meant remembering also the existence of the someone or something that had made him a prisoner here. The whoever it was who was in the pyramid. That the pyramid might have been an automated mechanical device never entered his mind for a moment. There had been a personal, directed, living viciousness behind the announcement that had condemned him to live as a beast. No, in that blank-walled metallic structure, whose treaded mechanical servants still prospected through the woods, there was something alive, something that could treat the awesome power of a solar tap as a human treated the attack of a mosquito, but something living, some being, some other who lived in the pyramid, moving, breathing, eating and gloating, or worse yet, entirely forgetful of what he had done to Harry Brennan. And now that he knew that the other was there, Harry began to dream of him nightly. At first, in his dreams, Harry whimpered with fear each time the dark shape he pursued seemed about to turn and show its face, but slowly, hatred came to grow inside and then outside his fear. Unbearable that Harry should never know the face of his destroyer. Lying curled in his nest of leaves under the moonless, star-brilliant sky, he snarled, thinking of his deprivation. Then hate came to strengthen him in the daylight also. From the beginning he had avoided the pyramid as a wild coyote avoids the farmyard where he was once shot by the farmer. But now, day after day, Harry circled closer to the alien shape. From the beginning he had run and hidden from the treaded prospecting machines. But now, slowly, he grew bolder, standing close enough at last to touch them as they passed. And he found that they paid no attention to him. No attention at all. He came to ignore them in turn, and day by day he ventured closer to the pyramid, until the morning came when he lay, silently snarling behind a bush, looking out across the tread-trampled space that separated him from the nearest copper-colored face of the pyramid. The space was roughly circular, 30 meters across, broken only by a small stream which had been diverted to loop inwards toward the pyramid before returning to its original channel. In the bight of the loop, a machine like a stork straddled the artificial 4-foot-wide channel, dipping a pair of long necks with tentacle-clustered heads into the water at intervals. Sometimes Harry could see nothing in the tentacles when they came up. Occasionally they carried some small water creature which they deposited in a tank. Making a perfect circle about the tramped area so that the stork-like machine was guarded within them was an open fence of slender wands set upright in the earth, far enough apart for any of the machines that came and went to the forest to pass between any two of them. There seemed to be nothing connecting the wands, and nothing happened to the prospecting machines as they passed through, but the very purposelessness of the wands filled Harry with uneasiness. It was not until after several days of watching that he had a chance to see a small native animal, frightened by something in the woods behind it, attempt to bolt across a corner of the clearing. As it passed between two of the wands, there was a waveriness in the air between them. The small animal leaped high, came down, and lay still. It did not move after that, and later in the day, Harry saw the indifferent treads of one of the prospecting machines bury it in the trampled earth in passing. That evening, Harry brought several captive small animals bound with grass up to the wand line and thrust them through, one by one, at different spots. All died. The next night he tried pushing a captive through a small trench scooped out so that the creature passed the killing line below ground level. But this one died also. For several days he was baffled. Then he tried running behind a slow-moving machine as it returned and tying a small animal to it with grass. For a moment, as the front of the machine passed through, he thought the little animal would live. But then, as the back of the machine passed the line, it too died. Snarling, Harry paced around outside the circle in the brush until the sun set and stars filled the moonless sky. In the days that followed, he probed every gap in the wand fence, but found no safe way through it. Finally, he came to concentrate on the 2 points at which the diverted stream entered and left the circle to flow beneath the stork-like machine. He studied this without really knowing what he was seeking. He did not even put his studying into words. Vaguely he knew that the water went in and the water came out again unchanged, and he also wished to enter and come out safely. Then, one day, studying the stream and the machine, he noticed that a small creature plucked from the water by the stork-like neck's mass of tentacles was still wriggling. That evening, at twilight, while there was still light to see, he waded up the 2-foot depth of the stream to the point where the killing line cut across its watery surface and pushed some more of his little animals toward the line underwater. 2 of the 3 surfaced immediately, twitched, and floated on limply to be plucked from the water and cast aside on the ground by the stork-like machine. But the 3rd swam on several strokes before surfacing and came up living to scramble ashore, race for the forest, and be killed by wands further around the circle. Harry investigated the channel below the killing line. There was water there up to his mid-thigh, plenty to cover him completely. He crouched down in the water and took a deep breath. Ducking below the surface, he pulled himself along with his fingertips, holding himself close to the bottom. He moved in as far as the tentacled ends. These grabbed at him, but could not reach far enough back to touch him. He saw that they came within a few inches of the gravel bottom. He began to need air. He backed carefully out and rose above the water, gasping. After a while, his hard breathing stopped, and he sat staring at the water for a long while. When it was dark, He left. The next day, he came and crept underwater to the grabbing area of the stork-like machine again. He scooped out several handfuls of the gravel from under the place where the arms grabbed before he felt a desperate need for air and had to withdraw. But that day began his labors. 4. 4 days later, the bottom under the grasping tentacles was scooped out to an additional 2 feet of depth, and the 5th twilight after that he pulled himself, dripping and triumphant, up out of the bend of the diverted stream inside the circle of the killing wands. He rested and then went to the pyramid, approaching it cautiously and sidelong like a suspicious animal. There was a door in the side he approached through which he had seen the prospecting machines trundle in and out. In the dimness he could not see it, and when he touched the metallic side of the structure, his fingers, grimed and toughened from scrambling in the dirt, told him little. But his nose, beast-sensitive now, located and traced the outline of the almost invisible crack around the door panel by its reek of earth and lubricant. He settled down to wait. An hour later, one of the machines came back. He jumped up, ready to follow it in, but the door opened just before it and closed the minute it was inside, nor was there any room to squeeze in beside it. He hunkered down, disappointed, snarling a little to himself. He stayed until dawn and watched several more machines enter and leave, but there was no room to squeeze inside, even with the smallest of them. During the next week or so, he watched the machines enter and leave nightly. He tied one of his small animals to an entering machine and saw it pass through the entrance, alive, and scamper out again with the next machine that left. And every night his rage increased. Then, wordlessly, one daytime after he had seen a machine deep in the woods lurch and tilt as its tread passed over a rock, inspiration took him. That night he carried through the water with him several cantaloupe-sized stones. When the first machine came back to the pyramid, in the moment in which the door opened before it, he pushed one of the rocks before the right-hand tread. The machine, unable to stop, mounted the rock with its right tread, tilted to the left, and struck against that side of the entrance. It checked, backed off, and put out an arm with the grasping end to remove the rock. Then it entered the opening, but Harry was already before it, having slipped through while the door was still up and the machine busy pulling the stone aside. He plunged into a corridor of darkness, full of clankings and smells. A little light from the opening behind him showed a further, larger chamber where other machines stood parked. He ran toward them. Long before he reached them, the door closed behind him and he was in pitch darkness, but the clanking of the incoming machine was close behind him, and the adrenalinized memory of a wild beast did not fail him. He ran, hands outstretched, directly into the side of the parked machine at which he had aimed and clambered up on it. The machine entering behind him clanked harmlessly past him and stopped moving. He climbed cautiously down in the impenetrable darkness. He could see nothing, but the new animal sensitivity of his nose offered a substitute for vision. He moved like a hunting dog around the chamber, sniffing and touching, and slowly a clear picture of it and its treaded occupants built up in his mind. He was still at this when suddenly a door he had not seen opened almost in his face. He had just time to leap backwards as a smaller machine with a box-like body and a number of upward-thrusting arms entered, trundled to the machine that had just come back, and began to relieve the prospecting machine of its sample box, replacing it with the one it carried itself. This much, in the dim light from the open door, Harry was able to see. But then the small machine turned back toward the doorway, and Harry, waking to his opportunity, ducked through ahead of it. He found himself in a corridor dimly lit by a luminescent strip down the center of the ceiling. The corridor was wide enough for the box-collecting machine to pass him, and in fact it rolled out around him as he shrank back against one metal wall. It went on down the corridor, and he followed it into a larger room with a number of machines, some mobile, some not, under a ceiling lit as the corridor had been with a crossing of translucent strip. In this area, all the machines avoided each other and him. They were busy with each other and at other incomprehensible duties. Hunched and tense, hair erect on the back of his neck and nostrils spread wide, Harry moved through them to explore other rooms and corridors that opened off this one. It took him some little time, but he discovered that they were all on a level, and there was nothing but machines in any of them. He found 2 more doors with shallow steps leading up to them, but these would not open for him. And though he watched by one for some time, no machine went up the steps and through it. He began to be conscious of thirst and hunger. He made his way back to the door leading to the chamber where the prospecting machines were parked. To his surprise, it opened as he approached it. He slipped through into darkness. Immediately, the door closed behind him, and sudden panic grabbed him when he found he could not open it from this side. Then self-possession returned to him. By touch, smell, and memory, he made his way among the parked machines and down the corridor to the outside door. To his gratification, this also opened when he came close. He slipped through into cool, fresh outer air in a sky already graying with dawn. A few moments later, wet but free, he was back in the woods again. From then on, each night he returned. He found it was not necessary to do more than put any sizable object before the returning machine. It would stop to clear the path, and he could enter ahead of it. Then, shortly after he was inside, a box-collecting machine would open the inner door. Gradually, his fear of the machines faded. He came to hold them in a certain contempt. They always did the same thing in the same situation, and it was easy to trick or outmaneuver them. But the 2 inner doors of the machine area with the steps would not open to him, and he knew the upper parts of the pyramid were still unexplored by him. He sniffed at the cracks of these doors, and a scent came through, not of lubricating medium and metal alone, but of a different musky odor that raised the hairs on the back of his neck again. He snarled at the doors. He went back to exploring minutely the machine level. The sample boxes from the prospecting machines he found were put on conveyor belt-like strips that floated up on thin air through openings in the ceiling, but the openings were too small for him to pass through. But he discovered something else. One day he came upon one of the machines taking a grill off the face of one of the immobile devices. It carried the grill away, and he explored the opening that had been revealed. It was the entrance to a tunnel or duct leading upward, and it was large enough to let him enter it. Air blew silently from it, and the air was heavy with the musky odor he had smelled around the doors that did not open. The duct tempted him, but fear held him back. The machine came back and replaced the grill, and he noticed that it fitted into place with a little pressure from the outside, top and bottom. After the machine had left, he pressed, and the grill fell out into his hands. After a long wait, he ventured timorously into the tube, but a sudden sound like heavy breathing mixed with a wave of a strong, musky odor came to him. He backed out in panic, fled the pyramid, and did not come back for 2 days. When he came back, the grill was again neatly in place. He removed it and sat a long time getting his courage up. Finally, he put the grill up high out of reach of the machine which had originally removed it and crawled into the duct. He crept up the tube at an angle into darkness. His eyes were useless, but the musky odor came strongly at him. Soon he heard sounds. There was an occasional ticking, then a thumping or shuffling sound. Finally, after he had crawled a long way up through the tube, there was a sound like a heavy puffing or hoarse breathing. It was the sound that had accompanied the strengthening of the musky odor once before, and this time the scent came strong again. He lay almost paralyzed with terror in the tube as the odor grew in his nostrils. He could not move until sound and scent had retreated. As soon as they had, he wormed his way backward down to the lower level, and freedom replaced the grill and fled for the outside air once again. But once more, in time, he came back. Eventually, he returned to explore the whole network of tubes to which the one he had entered connected. Many of the branching tubes were too small for him to enter, and the biggest tube he could find led to another grill from which the musky-smelling air was blasted with force. Clearly, it was the prime mover for the circulation of air through the exhaust, half of the pyramid's ventilating system. Harry did not reason it out to himself in those intellectual terms, but he grasped the concept wordlessly and went back to exploring those smaller tubes that he could crawl into. These he found terminated in grills set in their floors through which he could look down and catch a glimpse of some chamber or other. What he saw was mainly incomprehensible. There were a number of corridors, a number of what could be rooms containing fixed or movable objects of various sizes and shapes. Some of them could be the equivalent of chairs or beds, but if so, they were scaled for a being plainly larger than himself. The lighting was invariably the low-key illumination he had encountered in the lower, machine level of the pyramid, supplied by the single translucent strip running across the ceiling. Occasionally, from one grill or another, he heard in the distance the heavy sound of breathing, among other sounds, and smelled more strongly the musky odor. But for more than a week of surreptitious visits to the pyramid, he watched through various grills without seeing anything living. 5. However, a day finally came when he was crouched, staring down into a circular room containing what might be a bed shape, several chair shapes, and a number of other fixed shapes with variously spaced and depthed indentations in their surfaces. In a far edge of the circular room was a narrow alcove, the walls of which were filled with ranked indentations, among which several lights of different colors winked and glowed. Suddenly, the dim illumination of the room began to brighten. The illumination increased rapidly so that Harry cringed back from the grill, lifting a palm to protect his dimness-accustomed eyes. At the same moment, he heard approaching the sound of heavy breathing and sniffed a sudden increase in the musky odor. He froze. Motionless above the grill, he stopped even his breathing. He would have stopped his heart if he could, but it raced, shaking his whole body and sounding its rapid beat in his ears until he felt the noise of it must be booming through the pyramid like a drum. But there was no sign from below that this was so. Then, sliding into sight below him, came a massive figure on a small platform that seemed to drift without support into the room. The aperture of the grill was small. Harry's viewpoint was cramped and limited, looking down directly from overhead. He found himself looking down onto thick, hairless, brown-skinned shoulders, a thick neck with the skin creased at the back, and a forward-sloping, hairless brown head, egg-shaped in outline from above, with the point forward. Foreshortened below the head and shoulders was a bulging chin line with something like a tusk showing. It had a squat, heavy, hairless, brown body and thick, short forearms with stubby claws at the end of 4-fingered hands. There was something walrus-like about the tusks and the hunching, and the musky odor rose sickeningly into Harry's human nostrils. The platform slid level with the alcove, which was too narrow for it to enter. Breathing hoarsely, the heavy figure on it heaved itself suddenly off the platform into the alcove, and the stubby hands moved over the pattern of indentations. Then it turned and heaved itself out of the alcove onto the flat bed surface adjoining. Just as Harry's gaze began to get a full-length picture of it, the illumination below went out. Harry was left staring dazzled into darkness, while the heavy breathing and the sound of the figure readjusting itself on the bed surface came up to his ears. After a while there was no noise but the breathing. But Harry did not dare move. For a long time he held his cramped posture, hardly breathing himself. Finally, cautiously, inch by inch, he retreated down the tube, which was too small to let him turn around. When he reached the larger tubes, he fled for the outside and the safety of the forest. The next day he did not go near the pyramid, or the next. Every time he thought of the heavy brown figure entering the room below the grill, he became soaked with the clammy sweat of a deep emotional terror. He could understand how the other had not heard him or seen him up behind the grill, but he could not understand how the alien had not smelled him. Slowly, however, he came to accept the fact that the other had not. Possibly the other did not have a sense of smell. Possibly there was no end to the possibilities. The fact was that the other had not smelled Harry, or heard him, or seen him. Harry was like a rat in the walls, unknown because he was unsuspected. At the end of the week, Harry was once more prowling around back by the pyramid. He had not intended to come back, but his hatred drew him like the need of a drug addict for the drug of his addiction. He had to see the other again, to feed his hate more surely. He had to look at the other while hating the alien and feel the wild black current of his emotions running toward the brown and hairless shape. At night, buried in his nest of leaves, Harry tossed and snarled in his sleep, dreaming of the small stream backing up to flood the interior of the pyramid, and the other drowning, of lightning striking the pyramid and fire racing through it, of the other burning. His dreams became so full of rage and so terrible that he woke, twisting and with the few rags of clothing that still managed to cling unnoticed to him, soaked with sweat. In the end, he went back into the pyramid. Daily he went back, and gradually it came to the point where he was no longer fearful of seeing the other. Instead, he could barely endure the search and the waiting at the grills until the other came into sight. Meanwhile, outside the pyramid in the forest, the frill-edged leaves began to dry and wither and drop. The little stream sank in its bed, only a few inches, but enough so that Harry had to dig out the bottom of the stream bed under the killing barrier in order to pass safely underwater into the pyramid area. One day he noticed that there were hardly any of the treaded machines out taking samples in the woods anymore. He was on his way to the pyramid through the woods when the realization struck him. He stopped dead, freezing in mid-stride like a hunting dog. Immediately there flooded into his mind the memory of how the parking chamber for the treaded machines inside the base of the pyramid had been full of unmoving vehicles during his last few visits. Immediately also he realized the significance of the drying leaves, the dropping of the water level of the stream, and something with the urgency of a great gong began to ring and ring inside him like the pealing of an alarm over a drowning city. Time had been when there had been no pyramid here. Time was now, with the year fading and the work of the collecting machines almost done. Time would be when the pyramid might leave, taking with it the other. He began to run instinctively toward the pyramid, but when he came within sight of it, he stopped. For a moment, he was torn with indecision, an emotional maelstrom of fear and hatred all whirling together. Then he went on. He emerged a moment later, dripping, a fist-sized rock in each hand, to stand before the closed door that gave the machines entrance to the pyramid. He stood staring at it. In broad daylight. He had never come here before in full daylight, but his head now was full of madness. Fury seethed in him, but there was no machine to open the door for him. It was then that the fury and madness in him might have driven him to pound wildly on the door with his stones or to wrench off one of the necks of the stork-like machine at the stream and try to pry the door open. Any of these insane things he might have done and so have attracted discovery and the awesome power of the machinery and killing weapons at the command of the other. Any such thing he might have done if he was simply a man out of his head with rage, but he was no longer a man. He was what the other had made him, an animal, although with a man locked inside him. And like an animal, he did not rave or rant any more than does the cat at the mouse hole, or the wolf waiting for the shepherd to turn in for the night. Instead, without further question, the human beast that had been Harry Brennan, that still called himself Harry Brennan, in a little locked-away back corner of its mind, dropped on his haunches beside the door and hunkered there, panting lightly in the sunlight and waiting. 4 hours later, as the sun was dropping close to the treetops, a single machine came trundling out of the woods. Harry tricked it with one of his stones and, still carrying the other, ran into the pyramid. He waited patiently for the small collecting machine to come and empty out the machine returned from outside, then dodged ahead of it. When it came into the interior, lower level of the pyramid, he made his way calmly to the grill that gave him entrance to the ventilating system, took out the grill, and entered the tube. Once in the system, he crawled through the maze of ductwork until he came at last to the grill overlooking the room with the alcove and the rows of indentations on the alcove walls. When he looked down through the grill, it was completely dark below. He could hear the horse breathing and smell the musky odor of the other, resting or perhaps asleep on the bed surface. Harry lay there for a number of slow minutes, smelling and listening. Then he lifted the second rock and banged with it upon the grill. For a second, there was nothing but the echoing clang of the beaten metal in the darkness. Then the room suddenly blazed with light, and Harry, blinking his blinded eyes against the glare, finally made out the figure of the other rising upright upon the bed surface. Great, round, yellow eyes in a pug-like face, with a thick upper lip wrinkled over two tusks, stared up through the grill at Harry. The lip lifted, and a bubbling roar burst from the heavy, fat-looking shape of the other. He heaved his round body off the bed surface and rolled, waddling across the floor to just below the grill. Reaching up with one blunt-clawed hand, he touched the grill, and it fell to the floor at his feet. Left unguarded in the darkness of the ductwork, Harry shrank back, but the other straightened up to his full, near 6.5 feet of height and reached up into the ductwork. His blunt, clawed hand fastened on Harry and jerked. Off balance, Harry came tumbling to the floor of the chamber. A completely human man probably would have stiffened up and broken both arms, if not his neck, in such a fall. Harry, animal-like, attempted to cling to the shape of the other as he fell, and so broke the impact of his landing. On the floor, he let go of the other and huddled away from the heavy shape, whimpering. The other looked down, and his round yellow eyes focused on the stone Harry had clung to even through his fall. The other reached down and grasped it, and Harry gave it up like a child releasing something he's been told many times not to handle. The other made another lower-toned, bubbling roar deep in his chest, examining the rock. Then he laid it carefully aside on a low table surface and turned back to stare down at Harry. Harry cringed away from the alien's stare and huddled into himself as the blunt fingers reached down to feel some of the rags of a shirt that still clung about his shoulders. The other rumbled interrogatively at Harry. Harry hid his head. When he looked up again, the other had moved over to a wall at the right of the alcove and was feeling about in some indentations there. He bubbled at the wall, and a second later, Harry's voice sounded eerily in the room. You are the one I made a beast. Harry whimpered, hiding his head again. You can't, said Harry's voice, even speak now. Is that so? Harry ventured to peek upward out of his folded arms, but ducked his head again at the sight of the cold, yellow eyes staring down at him. I thought you would be dead by now, said the disembodied voice of Harry, hanging in the air of the chamber. Amazing. Survival completely, without equipment. Must keep you now. The eyes, yellow as topaz, considered Harry, huddled abjectly on the floor. Cage. Collector's item. The alien revolved back to the indentations of the wall a little way from the alcove. The broad, fleshy back turned contemptuously on Harry, who stared up at it. The pitiful expression of fear on Harry's face faded suddenly into a soundless snarl. Silently he uncoiled, snatched up the rock the other had so easily taken from him, and sprang with it onto the broad back. As he caught and clung there, one arm wrapped around a thick neck, the stone striking down on the hairless skull, his silent snarl burst out at last into the sound of a scream of triumph. The other screamed too, a bubbling roar, as he clumsily turned, trying to reach around himself with his thick, short arms and pluck Harry loose. His claws raked Harry's throat-encircling arm, and blood streamed from the arm. But it might have been so much stage makeup for the effect it had in loosening Harry's hold. Screaming, Harry continued to pound crushingly on the other's skull. With a furious spasm, the alien tore Harry loose, and they both fell on the floor. The other was first up, and for a second he loomed like a giant over Harry, as Harry was scrambling to his own feet and retrieving the fallen rock. But instead of attacking, the other flung away, lunging for the alcove and the control indentations there. Harry reached the alcove entrance before him. The alien dodged away from the striking rock. Roaring and bubbling, he fled, waddling from his human pursuer, trying to circle around the room and get back to the alcove. Half a head taller than Harry and twice Harry's weight, he was refusing personal battle and putting all his efforts into reaching the alcove with its rows of indented controls. Twice Harry headed him off, and then by sheer mass and desperation, the other turned and burst past into the alcove, thick hands outstretched and grasping at its walls. Harry leaped in pursuit, landing and clinging to the broad, fleshy back. The other stumbled under the added weight and fell, face down. Triumphantly yelling, Harry rode the heavy body to the floor, striking at the hairless head, and striking and striking. 6. Some time later, Harry came wearily to his senses and dropped a rock he no longer had the strength to lift. He blinked around himself like a man waking from a dream, becoming aware of a brilliantly lit room full of strange shapes and of a small alcove, the walls of which were covered with rows of indentations in which something large and dead lay with its head smashed into ruin. A deep, clawing thirst rose to take Harry by the throat, and he staggered to his feet. He looked longingly up at the dark opening of the ventilator over his head, but he was too exhausted to jump up, cling to its edge, and pull himself back into the ductwork, from which he could return to the stream outside the pyramid and to the flowing water there. He turned and stumbled from the chamber into unfamiliar rooms and corridors. A brilliant light illuminated everything around him as he went. He sniffed and thought he scented, through the musky reek that filled the air about him, the clear odor of water. Gradually, the scent grew stronger and led him at last to a room where a bright stream leaped from a wall into a basin where it pooled brightly before draining away. He drank deeply and rested. Finally, satiated, he turned away from the basin and came face to face with a wall that was all reflecting surface, and he stopped dead, staring at himself like Adam before the fall. It was only then, with the upwelling of his returning humanness, that he realized his condition, and words, spoken aloud for the first time in months, broke harshly and rustily from his lips like the sounds of a machine unused for years. "My God," he said croakingly, "I've got no clothes left." And he began to laugh, cackling, rasping more unnaturally even than his speech. His laughter lifted and echoed hideously through the silent alien rooms. But it was laughter all the same, the one sound that distinguishes man from the animal. He was 6 months after that learning to be a complete human being again and finding out how to control the pyramid. If it had not been for the highly sophisticated safety devices built into the alien machine, he would never have lived to complete that bit of self-education. But finally he mastered the controls and got the pyramid into orbit, where he collected the rest of his official self and shifted back through the alternate universe to Earth. He messaged ahead before he landed, and everybody who could be there was on hand to meet him as he landed the pyramid. Some of the hands that had slapped his back on leaving were raised to slap him again when at last he stepped forth among them. But, not very surprisingly, when his gaunt figure in a spare coverall, now too big for it, with shoulder-length hair and burning eyes, stepped into their midst, not one hand finished its gesture. No one in his right senses slaps an unchained wolf on the back, and no one, after one look, wished to risk slapping the man who seemed to have taken the place of Harry. Of course, he was still the same man they had sent out. Of course he was. But at the same time, he was also the man who had returned from a world numbered 1242, and from a duel to the death there with a representative of a race 100 times more advanced than his own. And in the process, he had been pared down to something very basic in his human blood and bone, something dating back to before the first crude wheel or chipped flint knife. And what was that? Go down into the Valley of the Shades and demand your answer of a dead alien with his head crushed in, who once treated the utmost powers of modern human science as a man treats the annoyance of a buzzing mosquito. Or, if that once mighty traveler in space-going pyramids is disinclined to talk, turn and inquire of other ghosts you will find there, those of the aurochs, the great cave bear, and the woolly mammoth. They, too, can testify to the effectiveness of naked men. The Friendly Man. Mark Torin was very surprised to find someone waiting for him. The waiter was a young, pleasant-looking man wearing an open-throated sport shirt with a pipe in his mouth. He took the pipe from his mouth to wave cheerfully and pointed through a doorway into what seemed a rather pleasant living room. "Come in," he said. "Come in and make yourself at home." Wondering, Mark followed him in. This was not according to what he had conceived as regulations. Did they have a reception room for all visitors from time? He looked around the room wonderingly as he took a chair. It looked like any ordinary room, comfortably furnished in the style of his own century. "You look puzzled," said the young man, who had taken a seat across from him, a deep leather armchair in which he lounged comfortably. Mark eyed him narrowly, noting the style of his clothes, which was the same as that of Mark's own. "I am," he said dryly. "You don't expect to go 50,000 years into the future and find the present." The young man chuckled. "You'd be surprised," he said. "Civilization has a way of coming full circle. Oh, by the way, my name's Merkel, and yours is—" "Mark Torin," said Mark. "What do you mean by full circle?" "Ups and downs," replied the young man airily. "Dark Ages, a period of scientific advance. Another Dark Ages, another period of scientific advance, and so on." Mark frowned. "That's odd," he said. "The cycle seemed that way in my time, surely, but according to my own prognostications, it should have leveled out to a steady uphill climb for the human race by at least 20,000 years after my time. As a matter of fact, that's why I chose to go this far into the future, simply because that time seemed so remote that no one of my time could imagine what the human race would be like." He interrupted himself suddenly. "If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a few questions about your present time." "Shoot," said the young man, blowing a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. "You speak my language?" asked Mark bluntly. "You're dressed as I am. How come?" "Oh, that," said Merkel. "We have instruments that allow us to look a little distance along the timeline in either direction. We saw you coming and got things fixed up to receive you." "That much trouble for one visitor?" asked Mark. "It wasn't much trouble." Merkel shrugged. "With our technology." "Then," said Mark, "I take it that your world is very different from what I see here." "Some," said Merkel. "We have a higher technological level, of course. At the same time, as I said, culturally, our civilization is at pretty much the same cyclic point that yours was at." "At the same time," Mark said, his eyes taking on for a second the fugitive gleam of the researcher, "it's going to be interesting for me." He paused, and when the other made no immediate response, continued. "You don't have any objection to my seeing it, do you?" he asked. "Oh, none. None at all," replied the young man hurriedly. "Of course, you understand we're going to have to give you and your temporal vehicle a bit of an examination, just to make sure there's nothing about either of you that might possibly be harmful to us." "I assure you," Mark was begging stiffly, when the young man interrupted with an apologetic air. "Oh, we realize that you have no intention of doing any harm, but you might, for example, be harboring disease germs to which we are no longer immune. Your ship might possess some latent energy which would react violently if it were inadvertently exposed to some of our technology. I assure you that there won't be anything to the examination. As a matter of fact, you can speed up the business considerably just by answering a few questions for me." Mark grimaced wryly. "I'd hoped the shoe would be on the other foot," he said. "I'm bursting with curiosity. However, go ahead." "First," said Merkel, "just to confirm the findings of our instruments, suppose you tell me from what time you come?" 2190 AD, said Mark. Merkel nodded. And what type of civilization did you have then? Well, said Mark, we considered ourselves fairly well advanced. Our rockets had reached as far as the moons of Jupiter, and we had fairly well established colonies on Mars and Venus. We were making fairly wide use of atomic power, although the installations were still so expensive as to restrict their use considerably. He broke off, somewhat embarrassed. I suppose all this sounds awfully primitive and childlike to you, he said. No, not at all, answered Merkel quickly. Not at all. Go on. Well, sociologically, we were, I suppose, pretty primitive. Equality among the sexes was firmly established, of course. There was still some suppression of minorities, but not much. The old Earth governments were still in force, although the real power was wielded by the large business and labor organizations. I see, interjected Merkel. Still the type of society where a strong man could hack his way to power. Why, yes, said Mark, and stopped abruptly. Why do you ask that? Oh, for no particular reason, replied Merkel easily. The situation is merely typical of such cyclic conditions as you've been describing. Tell me more about the extent to which planetary exploration had gone. No farther than Jupiter, you say? Not that I know of, answered Mark. And I imagine I would have heard of any further advances. Interesting, said Merkel. Very interesting. He rose suddenly to his feet. I'll leave you now, he said. The machines are ready to scan you in your machine. The process will take several days, but I assure you will not cause you the slightest discomfort. Make yourself comfortable here. This building is yours, although I must warn you about stepping outside of it until you're told it is safe to do so. Of course, said Mark. But there are a few more things I'd like to ask you. He broke off, for Merkel had already passed through the door and was gone. After the young man left, Mark sat for a while in thought. The reception he had been accorded was not what he had expected, but then he chided himself for expecting it to conform to any preconceived notions. He was not the first explorer in time to leave from the period of the 22nd century, but if he returned, he would be the first to do that. The risk was a calculated one, and he took it with no mental reservations. It was, however, with some idea of playing safe that he had set his destination at 50,000 years in the future. Briefly, Mark had been hoping to get beyond the cyclic ups and downs to which Merkel had referred. Inevitably, he had thought, reverses and re-reverses of history must come to an end eventually as man grew in mental maturity. How far can the human race go in 50,000 years, considering its progress during the past 5,000 years of known history? Mark had asked himself that question and answered it with the obvious reply that it was impossible to imagine the answer. The most he could guess was that by then man would be a new creature entirely, bearing only the remotest resemblance to his ancestor of the 22nd century. The least Mark had imagined was that man, 50,000 years from then, would have passed into a completely new era. And now, here was Merkel to tell him that, aside from a greatly improved technology, man was still on the same merry-go-round of history that he had been on in Mark's time. Mark shook his head over the information. Merkel's answer was plausible, even reasonable, but it did not feel right. Mark shook the notion from his head and rose to explore the building where he was being temporarily held a prisoner. It consisted of 3 rooms and all the appurtenances of the normal 22nd century bungalow. The only difference was a stairway that led up to the open roof, which gave him a view of the surrounding country. The countryside was grassy and rolling, the air astoundingly fresh and clear, so that the few isolated groups of buildings he could see in the distance stood out sharply, like meticulously executed miniatures. He was struck by the isolated position of his bungalow, and had halfway resolved to ask Merkel about it, when it struck him that possibly they were playing extra safe in the matter of possible contagion. Still, that was odd, when Merkel had not seemed at all shy about coming into quite close proximity to him. Of course, the scientific worker sometimes took long chances. He shrugged his shoulders and went back down the stairs. "I'll just check the time machine," he thought, "and then get some sleep. As soon as the examination period is over, there'll no doubt be plenty to do." But when he came to the spot of his arrival, the time machine was gone. 2 days later, Merkel returned. Mark did not hear him enter, but there he was, suddenly, in the entrance to the room where they had had their first interview. "Hello," said Merkel with a friendly smile. "How are things going?" Mark jumped out of his seat. "You've taken my machine," he snapped. "Why, yes," said Merkel. "It was easier to take it to the machines, which would scan it, than to bring the machines here. I imagine you'll have it back in a day or so." "Oh," Mark answered, somewhat mollified. Merkel came on into the room, followed by an older, thinner man who nodded pleasantly to Mark. "Mark," said Merkel, "I'd like to have you meet Termy, one of our archaeologists. He's one of the group who's been studying that machine of yours, and he's found it interesting, so interesting, in fact, that he wanted me to ask you if you wouldn't mind chatting with him about it." Mark could not help feeling slightly flattered. The thin line of his mouth relaxed. "Well, of course," he said. "Anything you would like to know." "Thank you, sir," responded Termy. "Shall we sit down?" All three took chairs, and Mark leaned forward, grasping his knees with his hands in an attitude of attentiveness. Termy's smooth voice flowed over him. "I must begin by an admission," said the archaeologist. "Our records of time machines are very incomplete, Mark, very. The most primitive ones of which we have any record belong to a date some 15,000 years later than your time. We assume that probably there was, following your time, a period of scientific retrogression in which the basic knowledge necessary to the construction of such a machine was lost. So that your machine stands alone in our experience without any means available to tie it to later developments. It is not even readily apparent to us how you operated it, and I thought, just to save us the time and effort of experimentation, that you might not mind explaining the process to us." "Not at all," answered Mark. "You must, of course, understand that there were others working on the subject of time travel during my period, and that my machine is by no means typical. But they were all founded on the same principles. Briefly, it was the development of psychomechanics that allowed real research on the subject of time travel to begin. Psychomechanics found that there was a definite connection between the human body's perception of time and its experience of time. That is, the body tended to react to what it perceived as a speeded-up time flow by speeding up itself. The Mackenwald distorter was the first instrument to exploit this reaction by accelerating a subject's perception of time as much as 3 times normal, and quite by accident it was discovered that inanimate objects in close proximity to the body also tended to be affected by the speed-up process. From the matter of distorting the body relative to time, it was a short step to the problem of distorting time relative to the body. And from the research done in that direction, finally was evolved the technique of putting the body in suspension relative to time. That is, into a timeless state. It's a little difficult to explain what I mean without demonstrating the processes as they occurred step by step. But it should be easy to understand how, once it was possible to put a living person into a timeless state, all that was necessary for time travel was to find a means of moving that body along the time stream to the point at which it wished to re-enter the time stream. Psychomechanics solved that difficulty by training the human mind to the point of using it as a propulsive unit in the timeless state. But this, of course, was possible since it takes, even in practice, almost no energy to move a body relative to the time stream. Termy leaned back in his chair and laughed. "No wonder," he said. "That's a good joke on us. No wonder we couldn't find any evidence of a propulsive unit on your machine, when the propulsive unit was in your head instead." "Well," said Mark, a trifle embarrassed, "it's something like that." "Well, well," said Termy, standing up. "Thank you for being so kind as to explain it to me, Mark. Sometime later I'll have to drop back and have another chat with you. There are a lot of aspects of your time on which I'd be glad to have some first-hand information." He turned toward the door. Merkel also rose to go, but Mark put out a hand to detain him. "Look here, Merkel," he said. "Aren't you through with investigating me now? I'd like to get out of here and see firsthand what this world of yours is like." Merkel stuffed his pipe thoughtfully. "As a matter of fact," he said, "you seem to be turning out to be a more complex character than we had expected, Mark, and we're not quite done yet. I imagine that in a week or more you can get out and around." "A week?" Possibly a week," answered Merkel. "Possibly less. And now I really must go." And wrenching his arm from Mark's grasp, he turned and was through the door before Mark could think of anything more to say. Mark jumped to the door behind him and flung it open, but there was nothing to be seen except a small sort of flying ship rising from the grass just outside the building. Defeated, Mark returned to the interior of the bungalow. The week passed, leaving Mark with food for thought. The bungalow was supplied with books of the 22nd century type, but on close inspection Mark was unable to find one that he had not read before. So he spent his time mostly on the roof of the building, enjoying the sunlight and pondering the reception that he was receiving in this world of the future. It was not until the week was nearly over that he was able to put his finger on the oddness of his situation, the feeling that had been bothering him ever since his arrival. It had to do with the reactions exhibited by Merkel, Termy, and the race they represented. Subconsciously, Mark had expected these men of the future to be, if anything, supremely sure of themselves and their actions, and it was a lack of this sureness that he seemed to notice in the two men he had met so far. He had assumed from the completeness of the building in which he found himself and the casual attitude of Merkel that they had been completely prepared for his arrival. Consequently, he had reasoned that there would be little fuss and bother about the investigation to which they insisted on submitting him. Instead, there seemed to be a great deal. It was puzzling. Consequently, when Merkel next returned at the end of the week, Mark was determined to pin him down on the matter of his further seclusion. "Look here, Merkel," he said, "I'm not questioning your right to take adequate defensive measures against whatever inimical hosts my mind or body may be harboring, but you can't keep me shut up like this with nothing to do. I'll go crazy. Man, I'm human, too." For some reason, Mark's words seemed to catch the other completely off balance. He continued to stand facing the visitor from time, with his usual smile and puffing with his usual serenity on his pipe. But otherwise it was exactly as if a switch in his mind had been clicked off. He stood, staring at Mark for such a long time that Mark grew alarmed, thinking that the man had been struck by some sudden strange paralysis. Then, just as suddenly, he came out of it. "You must stay here," he said. "It is impossible for you to go out right now." "But," cried Mark. "I'm sorry," said Merkel, and turning on his heels, fairly ran out the door to his waiting flyer. Mark, puzzled and angry, paced the bungalow after Merkel had left. He had no longer any doubt that he was being deliberately cut off from the world of the future. Why? He wondered. What on earth could be so wrong with him that he was not allowed even a close-up glimpse of the cities he could see from the roof? And out of his frustration and the temper-wearing pressure of nearly 2 weeks' enforced idleness, he formed a plan. That night he crept up on the roof, being careful to allow no light to show. A half-insane plan had formed in his head. They had warned him against going out of the building, but the front door was unlocked. He assumed that if they expected him to leave against orders, they would not expect him to go to the trouble of dropping off one side of the roof rather than walking directly out the door. At any rate, he would chance it. He slithered over the roof's low railing, hung by his hands for a second, and then released his grip. He fell, but not hard, and after rolling over a couple of times in the soft grass, lay still and waited. There was no alarm. After a while, he got to his feet and moved softly off through the night to where the nearest city gleamed against the night sky. He had estimated that the city was some 8 or 10 miles away, but after trudging for 3 or 4 minutes, he was surprised to see that the glow of its lights was considerably stronger, so that it appeared to light up half of the sky. Cautiously he slowed his pace, but the glow increased with such rapidity that he finally had to drop into the grass for fear of being seen outlined against the sky. He crept forward. There was a small hillock in his way, and for a moment this blacked out sight of the city. Then he reached the top of it and looked over. The glare hit him full in the face, and he gave a sudden cry of animal fear. For the city was only a model. For a second he lay staring at it, and then he had jumped to his feet and was running down upon it. Its miniature buildings towered to his chest, and the tiny streets were just wide enough for him to walk through. Unbelievingly, he ran his fingers over the structures. They were complete in every detail, little masterpieces of imitation, but it was not just that set his mind reeling. It was the fact that every one was a model of some building in his hometown. Each one was a replica of a structure he had seen and known. Not one was unfamiliar. Trembling, he lifted his eyes from the city. Beyond it trembled a shimmering haze on which his eyes refused to focus. Wonderingly, he moved toward it. It hung like a curtain of mist just beyond the farther limits of the city. He strode up to it, stood in front of it, and cautiously extended his hands out and into it. It gave without resistance, and his hands plunged through, disappearing from sight. With a wordless cry, he jerked them back and looked at them in the reflected light of the city. They were whole and good. He stood for a second more, gathering his nerve, and then, taking a deep breath, walked through the curtain. His feet passed from soft turf to solid surface. The mist thinned before his eyes. He brushed the last of it away with one hand and saw desolation. He stood on a street where giants might have walked, and on either side towered buildings. Not miniatures, these, but mighty edifices that towered up until they were lost to sight in the night sky. But there was no light here, and no movement. The fact was written on the dust of the street in the blank and staring windows of the buildings. The city was deserted. Fear returned to Mark Torin with redoubled force. He felt lost and insignificant like an insect upon the windowpane of eternity, about to be squashed by the thumb of a god, and he burst into wild, unreasoning flight down the street. After some distance, he obeyed the impulse to hide and darted into the open doorway of one of the buildings. "Greetings!" boomed a deep voice. He leaped backward in sheer panic to the street outside. The voice ceased. He turned and darted wildly for another doorway and slipped inside. "Greetings!" boomed a voice again. He took a step backward, but this time curiosity in part conquered fear, so that he stayed where he was, flattened against a wall in the shadows. And the voice went on talking. Only this time he realized that the words were not impacts of sound on his ear, but welled up unbidden within his mind. "Greetings, visitor," came the words. "From wherever you have come, no matter what far-flung starborn world may be your home, greetings. You stand at the birthplace of the human race. This was our breeding place, this earth. Here we lifted our heads from the earth. Here we stood upright and walked. Here we grew and reached out to the stars. And here we have left our memorial of the last men to be planet-bound. Look about you and see. The heritage of the human race is here. Now we, the last men to be planet-bound, have finished our memorial and go to join our brothers between the stars. We do not go to some home, for we will have no other home. We have passed beyond the need of home, and all the reaches of stellar space are the same to us. For it was never ordained that man should cling to the small bodies of planets, when the endless regions of the ether are his to wander in, as a bird might wander in the sky, winged and armored by the power of his mind. So, to you, visitor, greetings. Look on the works of man, his buildings, his machines, and the creatures of his machines. All this he has left, as you will one day leave your works, and all that your hands have wrought for the greater freedom that comes between the stars." The voice ceased, and Mark turned from the doorway into the moonlit street again and stopped. Waiting for him, rank on silent rank, were Merkel and Terme, and others like them, although the others glinted, gaunt and bright in the moonlight, without the kindness of artificial flesh to cover their metal bones. They said nothing, and their eyes glittered on him, and Mark knew that he should feel frightened, but the voice inside of the building had drained fear from him, and he felt only pity for the ones before him. "So," he said, finally, "you are the creatures of the machines." "Yes," the answer came like a sighing wind from the crowd. "And I am a man," said Mark. The pity inside him welled up, and he asked gently, "What were you trying to do? What did you hope to learn from me?" "We were trying to learn life," answered Merkel for them all. "We are earthbound because, while we can think, we have no imagination. Man's imagination has taken him between the stars. We thought if we could learn to go back to the time when man was still learning, we could learn too." "But," said Mark, "you could not use my machine unless you had imagination. The use of psychomechanics requires it." They did not answer. "But why didn't you just come out directly and ask me?" asked Mark. "And why did you hide all this," and his arm swept out to indicate the buildings, "from me?" "Because we hate you," said Merkel unemotionally. You are something we can never be, and so we hate you. But you haven't harmed me, began Mark, bewildered, and then the realization struck him. You cannot harm me, he said. We cannot harm you, said Merkel. Therefore, we hate you. There was a long silence. I'm sorry, whispered Mark, but I can't do anything for you. No, said Merkel. You can do nothing for us, and we can learn nothing from you. The building in which you stayed was a gigantic scanner. We have analyzed you, we have read you like a book, and we do not understand you. We have taken your machine to pieces, down to its component atoms, and put it back together again. But we cannot operate it. Now we only want you to leave. He lifted his hand. The crowd parted, and Mark saw his time machine standing in the midst of them. We cannot travel in time, continued Merkel, but there are machines here which can block off time from our period to yours. We will use them when you're gone. We have learned from your visit that it is not a good thing for your kind to meet ours. Now, go. Mark stepped forward as if in a dream and walked to his machine, down the waiting corridor of the friendly men. Without a word, he stepped inside it and lifted his hand to the controls. Then some inexplicable emotion made him turn, and he looked once more at Merkel, who was standing beside him. Beneath his feet, the generators began to warm up with a humming sound. Robot, said Mark, almost wonderingly, staring at Merkel. The mists of a vanishing time began to swirl up between them. Through the haze, he saw the plastic face of the other, strangely distorted. "Don't curse me so," cried the friendly man.